Welcome to today's explainer. Go ahead, take a slow, deep breath, and just settle in for a second. Today, we're going to explore a deeply introspective, yet incredibly liberating framework for how we live our daily lives. We're going to look at exactly how to navigate the overwhelming pressures of our modern world without, completely losing our minds or our souls in the process. So let me ask you something right off the bat. Have you entered the quantum superposition state today? I'm talking about that agonizing, all too familiar feeling of being just entirely stuck. It's that heavy space where you're caught perfectly between desperately wanting to grind and achieve and just wanting to give up entirely and melt into your couch. If you feel this way, trust me, I am speaking directly to you right now. You know the feeling, right? Your body is supposedly resting on the bed, but your brain, it's running 1,000 miles an hour, frantically simulating your future unemployment and failure. Or maybe you finally muster up the willpower to open your laptop to work, and your hand instantly, almost like it has a mind of its own, starts scrolling through social media. You're failing at working and you're failing at resting. Well, I want to reassure you right now, this paralyzing, half-alive state of mental friction, it is entirely normal. And more importantly, it is not your fault. All right, let's dive right into Chapter 1, Schrödinger's effort. What? Society feeds us this completely false dichotomy. It tells us you either grind yourself to dust or you're just a lazy failure who lies flat. But that binary, it's a total trap. Instead, we're aiming for something different here, something highly elastic. We like to call it the Mayfly spirit. Think about it. A mayfly lives for a single day, but its existence is brilliantly vibrant. It completely rejects the heavy, exhausting, grand narratives of leaving an eternal legacy. Instead, it chooses to simply dance lightly in the present currents of life. That kind of flexibility is exactly our goal today. To figure out where all this exhaustion comes from, let's look at Chapter 2, Adler and the Grinding Virus. Take a look at this historical diagram of Adler's inferiority-superiority dynamics. Notice how, right at the very bottom, we have these deeply rooted infantile inferiority feelings. Basically, fears of being disparaged or feelings of weakness. And from there, you see a massive curve pointing straight upward toward the self-ideal as goal and the feeling of being above. What Adler shows us here is that this relentless, exhausting climb isn't always driven by a healthy passion. Often, it's actually a compensatory, safeguarding tendency. Basically, we grind because we're desperately trying to safeguard ourselves against our own hidden feelings of inadequacy. So, the absolute crucial point here is distinguishing between true ambition and what Adler would basically classify as toxic vanity. So much of what society praises as ambition is actually a fear-driven compensatory marathon. We push ourselves to the absolute brink of collapse because we're terrified of being ordinary, or worse, being unloved. It's this vicious, self-destructive loop fueled entirely by an oversized longing for validation. And honestly, what's the result of this relentless pursuit? It leads straight to what we can call mental anemia. Think of societal expectations, school, work, status, as this giant pendulum swinging back and forth, constantly harvesting your energy. It leaves you with totally paralyzed emotions. You experience a complete and utter energy drain. At that point, using your willpower is essentially just whipping a dead horse. You become an empty shell simply because your psychological energy has been entirely consumed by anxiety. But wait, if extreme grinding leaves us anemic, what happens when we do nothing at all? Let's explore Chapter 3, Lying Flat's Black Hole. This actually goes way back to early psychological theory. Wilhelm Wundt, one of the founding figures of psychology, proposed something called the contrast law. He argued that human perception and emotion heavily rely on friction and contrast. Think about it. A well-earned break feels amazing specifically because it directly contrasts with intense effort. But if you embrace endless passive rest, if you just lie flat indefinitely, there is absolutely no contrast. Your senses dull, that relaxation quickly mutates into the suffocating, stagnant pool. And that leads us straight into a state of existential vacuum. When you drop all your goals and completely sever your social cooperation, you don't actually find freedom, you find a profound void. As humans, we have this hardwired evolutionary need for connection and contribution. So when we engage in pure rotting, we trigger what is essentially an imposter's guilt. Our brain's alarm bells start going off because total isolation and passivity actually feel like a direct threat to our very survival. So where on earth is the middle path here? Let's turn to Chapter 4, Zhuangzi's useless use. The ancient philosopher Zhuangzi had this brilliant concept of free and easy wandering that illustrates this perfectly. In one of his famous parables, he contrasts this massive giant penguin with a tiny little dove. The penguin is absolutely colossal. It needs a cyclone of 90,000 miles of wind just to take off. It carries this heavy, monumental burden just to sustain its flight. But the little dove? It just flutters around the brush, entirely content in its smallness. Zhuangzi totally shatters the myth that bigger is always better. The key isn't to be the biggest bird, it's to find your own perfectly comfortable space in the world. As Zhuangzi famously said, only when one knows the useless can one speak of the useful. He told this amazing story of a large, ancient tree that survived for centuries precisely because its trunk was so crooked and knotted that a carpenter literally couldn't use it for lumber. Because it was useless to the demands of society, it avoided the carpenter's axe and lived a long, peaceful life. Seriously, there is an absolute defense in embracing a little bit of their own uselessness. In modern terms, you can think of this as tactical concealment. You absolutely do not have to be the perfect, hyper-productive tool for everyone else's needs. Instead of desperately rowing against the raging river of societal expectations, exhausting yourself just to prove your worth, you need to act as an observer, make micro-adjustments, find the path of least resistance. Basically, you need to stop rowing and start surfing the waves. Okay, so how do we actually apply this stuff? Let's get into Chapter 5, Mayfly Practical Guide. First things first, we have to lower the life or death importance we put on our tasks. If every single project feels like a must-succeed or else scenario, of course you're going to stay paralyzed. Once you release that extreme pressure, we can apply the work of American psychologist William James. He talked about the fiat, which is the active, intentional command of the will. When you're stuck in that mental friction, don't rely on huge, sudden burst of motivation. Instead, use the fiat to build tiny neural habit grooves. You bypass friction by making the start incredibly small. Just command your attention to do one tiny action. Write 3 words, read 1 sentence, so that starting requires almost zero willpower. Next up, psychologist Carl Jung gave us this amazing concept of integrating our shadow. Look, when you feel intensely lazy or just furious at the system, your first instinct is probably to suppress it, right? But that just drains you even more. Instead, you don't destroy your negative feelings. You harvest that raw shadow energy. You redirect your laziness or your anger right into creative, liberating output. You let those frustrations become the actual fuel for your art, your humor, or your unique problem solving. Now, let me give you a super practical 5-minute physical grounding technique. You can literally do this quietly at your desk when you feel completely overwhelmed. First, close your eyes and intentionally withdraw your attention from the outside world. Second, subtly and slowly rotate your pelvis in your chair. You want to physically unlock that bone-deep tension held in your core. Third, take a deep breath and silently, fully exhale all the trapped, anxious air in your chest. And finally, rub your hands together to create some heat and place your warm palms over your closed eyes to seal that centered energy. It is an absolute game changer, an instant physical reset to recover your focus. Let's tie this all together now in Chapter 6, Freely Dancing Mayfly. We absolutely have to shatter this massive illusion of the deferred future. You know that voice in your head? The one saying, "I'll finally be happy when I graduate," or "I'll relax as soon as I get that promotion." The future is a phantom. True happiness, that real lightness of the mayfly, only exists right now. In the warmth of a sip of tea, in the quiet blooming of a flower, in the simple, literal act of breathing in the present moment. Everything else is just noise. Ultimately, guys, life is kind of like a game. And if we can just take a step back and hold a bit of cosmic humor about the whole shebang, realizing that in the grand scheme of things, we all turn to dust anyway, we realize we've already transcended the rules. We don't have to be defined by our productivity or our burnout. My sincere hope for you is this. May you grind with elegance when you choose to move, and may you lie flat entirely without guilt when you need to rest. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. The river of life is moving, whether you're anxious about it or not. So, are you going to continue exhausting yourself fighting against the current just to prove your worth? Or will you embrace the spirit of the mayfly and finally learn to surf the waves of space and time? The choice and the freedom is entirely yours.